So tonight I was tasked with telling you what I like to have when I calve and what's in my toolbox and what I use. So obviously I am a veterinarian and I'm also a cattle producer. So I am practical. And so these go on both, they go with both avenues of my life, and they're easy to use. It's also just my opinion. So if there's something in there that maybe you have that doesn't work for you, I'd love to hear it. And I don't get any royalties for anything that I tell you about. So it's just things that I've liked throughout my practice. So my one and only soapbox slide is going to be to make sure that you're prepared. This quote right here is great. If you're failing to plan, you're planning to fail. So I don't want you to go out and find this picture and think, what in the world am I going to do? So as long as you are prepared and you have a plan, you don't necessarily need to know how to fix this. You just need to know who to call or where to go when you see that. So what's in my toolbox? It's literally a toolbox. I carry around a toolbox that's very similar to this. It's a nice, lightweight, it's portable. It's got these little compartments on the top. I really like that because I put my needles and my blades in there, and they're easy to get to. But the biggest thing that I'd like you guys to have in your kit is to make sure that you have an area that tells what your veterinary contact information is. So right here, this is just a picture of my card, but seriously just taping it inside the box with the number of the name of the veterinarian and the phone number so that you know the first place to call. The other piece of advice that I would have would be, if you are a client of a multi-doctor practice, to make sure that you know who all the veterinarians are in that practice. So it's a lot easier to build relationships in the middle of the afternoon when you know a face to a name than it is at 2 in the morning. So just get to know everybody that could possibly be there when you reach out and make that phone call. So inside my box, I have a halter and a rope. You can also use a lariat. This is important for me because I use it in calves or heifers, basically. Like whenever I have my calving pen, sometimes their heads are going to be a little bit too small for the opening of that chute. And if you only have 3 feet between that cow, you and the wall, we want to make sure that you're safe. So slip a halter over the head of that cow. And then the other hint is to tie it over to the left. Now, talking specifically about my setup, a calving pen, I have the left side open so that I can get to it. So a little hint is if you take that halter and you loosely tie her head down to the left side of that head catch, most of the time, if they're going to go lay down, they're going to lay down with their feet towards the side that you turn the head. So that's helpful because you want her feet to head that way and obviously not into the side of the wall. The other thing that you can use your rope for, if you know how to cast, there's a little picture right here in casting a cow. If you don't know how to do this, I wouldn't recommend just starting it when you're in the middle of a major dystocia, but it is nice to have on hand when you do need them to lay down. Kind of throw that loop over their head, you make a half hitch right behind the shoulder and then another one right in front of the udder, and you pull back on that rope and she'll lay down for you. For me personally, it's easier to pull a calf if she's standing. However, it's a lot easier for her if she's laying down, and some people will prefer to have them down. And as a mother myself, I've had 3 babies. I would much rather lay down than stand up, so I understand where they're at. It is just easier for the birth canal too. You can prevent a lot of that hip lock if they can get that the hip changed. And then the last thing I do with that rope is to just kind of tie back a leg when I'm going to milk out that cow. We don't want her to knock over the colostrum, or we don't want you to get kicked either. So the second thing that's in there that's really important is OB sleeves and lube. You know, you can never have too much lube when you're dealing with dystocias and pulling calves. The one right here in the middle is the one that I use the most. It's just a non-spermicidal generic OB lube. Obviously, that's a big gallon jug because I use a lot of it, but for your toolbox, I would recommend putting some of it into a squirt bottle. They also sell it in like toothpaste tube sizes, so those are easy and handy and portable, but definitely make sure you have some of that. This is J-Lube over here on the right, and if you have never used J-Lube, I wouldn't recommend just starting. It's kind of some nasty stuff, but it's crazy slippery. I have seen multiple veterinarians and producers wipe out on cement floors, and you don't need any other issues when you're trying to deal with pulling a calf, but it does work. Just make sure that you know what you're getting into because it is hard to clean up. And then as far as OB sleeves go, this is just a little hint. I have little hands and little arms, which actually doesn't mean that I'm not strong, but it means that it helps me when I go in. I can put both arms into that cow, but I need to have a smaller sleeve. And they do make size small. They come in pink, so they're really fun. they're easy for me to use. The bigger ones will kind of fall off of your hand, but I do put a little latex glove over the top of it just for dexterity in my fingers. They come in all different sizes. So then another thing you need to have is some sort of disinfectant. I personally use Novosan, so that's a chlorhexidine solution. You can use betadine scrub, or you don't even need to get this fancy. You can simply have another squirt bottle full of dish soap. You're not going to use this directly. You're obviously going to dilute this with some warm water, but I squirt a little bit of that Novosan solution into a bucket with some warm water, and then I use that to clean the whole back end of the cow. That perineal region needs to be as clean as we can get it. We do not want manure into the birth canal. And granted, I know that it's hard to not get that done, but if you can be the cleanest that you can, and also use that solution to wash your arms up. The other hint I do is I put my chain or my straps into that bucket of solution so that it's warm and ready to go when I reach down to get it. So speaking about chains and straps, it's kind of a toss-up on what you want to use. I have used both in practice and in life. If I have a preference, I'm going to pick chains. And I'll tell you why. There's two reasons. The first reason is that I feel like I can get them cleaner. So the straps, sometimes you just get some of that birth material on there, that placenta, and it just gets really stringy and you don't get it as clean as you'd like to have it. But the big reason is in this picture right here. So a chain is longer and I'm going to be able to get more of it onto the feet. And I can make this half hitch. And this is very, very important. So this is something that if you don't know how to do, you should ask your veterinarian to definitely give you a demonstration, because it's very important. You actually will make a loop on the end of that chain and put it over above the dew claw. And then you're going to make a nice little half hitch. You just flip it over and you're going to put that down below the dew claw. And that's going to prevent extra pressure from one spot. So you're basically trying to divide up the amount of pressure when you're pulling. It's important because there's a little growth plate here, and that's basically a joint that's really soft that expands as the calf grows. And when those break, they're not fixable, honestly. So you want to avoid that at all costs. So that's why I like chains. And then the other thing that would be really helpful to invest in if you don't have them already would just be a set of these handles. So just 2 of these little handles are really helpful. Honestly, you shouldn't put more force than 2 people to pull a calf. And if you can't get it out with 2 people's force, it probably won't come out that way, or you shouldn't pull it out that way. So you don't even necessarily need to have a calf jack. I'm not saying that's bad, because I use one a lot too, but these handles will help you get a lot of pressure. If you have one and another person has one, and you pull when she pushes and you rest when she rests, and you get slow advancements of those feet, then you should, you're in the game. Now, Dr. Funk is going to talk next week about how to fix some of these issues and kind of talk you through getting some dystocias and correct them. I'll just tell you, my little hint is when you're pulling on these, you have to have advancement, and there's no magic number of 4 inches, 6 inches, something. You should see it moving more than what it was before. And also, you never ever pull if you just have 1 leg and a head, or 2 legs and no head. That's a bad situation. So that's when you reach for that number to call somebody for help. So the next thing I have in my toolbox would be some old towels and a couple rags. The towels are really important. Once you get that little guy out of there, you want to use those to really rub down that calf. Rubbing will stimulate the phrenic nerve, which is a nerve that innervates into the diaphragm. That's that big muscle that separates the chest from the abdomen. That helps them take that breath and stimulate them to start breathing. You can also, and you guys probably know this, but sticking a finger up into their nostril or taking a piece of that bedding, that straw, and just kind of tickling up there, that stimulates that gasping reflex to also take a breath. Sometimes they'll sneeze some of that stuff out. One other little trick, and I tried to find you a good data point to tell you that this works or not. And there's not a lot out there in research for acupuncture, but I've used it in practice, and it's just a little hint, and it has worked. But you take the muzzle of this little calf, and you take a little 22 gauge needle, and you just directly poke that right into the middle of the muzzle, and you just do a little twist. And that's actually a little acupuncture point that will stimulate the central nervous system that also gets them to take a breath. This has worked for me for numerous times. I mean, sometimes it won't work, but it's an easy thing to try. Now, I wouldn't go stabbing like a 16, 14 gauge needle in there. Make sure you have a little one, but it does seem to help. So the next important thing that I have in my box is colostrum replacers. So I don't have a preference. These are just two that I have on hand, and so I took a picture of them. And also a whisk. Make sure you have a whisk on hand because they need to be mixed up properly. My biggest soapbox would be to make sure you read the package. Everyone is different, and they all contain different amounts. So if you'll see this one right here has 150 grams of IgG. And IgG is the antibody that comes from mom, because remember, those babies are born completely like a blank slate. They need to get everything from mom to be able to fight off infections. And research has shown that you should have greater than 100 grams of IgG for those babies, but more recent research has actually shown up to 150 to 200 grams. So there's quite a bit that they need. If you pick up a bag of colostrum supplement, it's going to be less expensive, but it's going to have much less IgG. So in theory, you can still probably use it, but you're probably going to need 3 or 4 bags to meet that 150 to 200 grams if it's a 50-gram bag, which then you're starting to talk about a lot of volume. Also, some of these are formulated to have better, for example, this one has some E. coli antibodies in it, so some of these have a little bit more formula for the extra protein and energy that they need. Regardless, if you don't, the best thing, regardless of all of these freeze-dried ones, is obviously mother knows best. So whatever the mom has is what that calf needs. The older the cow, usually the better the colostrum quality. The higher the body condition score, it's usually better, and if they have a good vaccine status. So whatever she has, she's passing on to her baby through that colostrum. And colostrum has more than just those antibodies. I mean, it also contains white blood cells, and those are really important to go and attack any sort of bugs that are in that calf to help them fight that off. It has other immunostimulants. It has the protein and the energy and the fats that's needed to grow. So mom first. I know sometimes you're tired and you don't want to milk her out, but if she's right there in this chute, it only makes sense to milk her out. There's a little hint if you're wanting to know how much she needs. Kind of think of this as an easy math problem. It's about 5% of the calf's body weight. That's what they need in colostrum those first 6 hours of life. So an 80-pound calf, 5% of that would be about 4 quarts. Granted, I know that's a lot. That's a high volume. My husband would say there's no way I'm going to get that much in a calf at one time, and you don't have to do it all at once, but you definitely want to think about timing, because timing is very, very important. Those first 4 hours is when you have the peak absorption. So their gut's really, really ready to take on anything that's there. And if you miss that window, you get to about 12 hours of time frame, it starts to slow down. By 24 hours, it's almost completely shut. So first 6 hours, we want to get those 4 quarts in there, make sure that they're getting going. Now, the other thing that I have in there is a clean calf feeder, a tube feeder. Double check and make sure that it's always clean. Make sure that there's no little areas that could snag. There's nothing that broke on it last year, that it's ready to go. This is an intimidating skill, but it's not too difficult once you can figure it out. Calves usually do best if you can stand them, but I respect the fact that most of the time we've just pulled this calf and he's not going to stand up, and so he's going to be sitting down. If that's the case, that's fine, he can lay down, but he needs to be sternal, and that just means he needs to be sitting up on his chest. So here you can see I've got this little baby right between my legs. I kind of pinch between my legs to hold him upright so he doesn't move back and forth. I will gently put my hand into his mouth to kind of get him to open up his mouth, and then take that tube with the bottle down so that there's no milk in the tube, obviously, when it first goes in. And we're going to slowly introduce that into the mouth. Now you can feel, if you can feel in the neck, like your own neck, you can feel it right there. Your trachea has cartilage rings in it, so it's hard. So you feel that. You do not feel the esophagus when there's nothing in it. The esophagus is just smooth muscle. Once that calf slowly swallows that tube, now you will feel 2 tubes. And the feeder tube should be on the left side as a general rule, but basically you will definitely feel the 2. If you don't feel the 2, then you're in the wrong spot. But it should be definite. And I would just always recommend give a feel before you even start so that you can kind of understand your landmarks and where you're at. So once you have it in the right spot, you just slowly raise the bottle and you start to give that baby the colostrum that it needs. And the calf will move. So it'll probably try to vocalize, it'll try to move around, and that's a stimulus from getting that warm colostrum into the stomach. So that's normal. So expect that a little bit. Now, I don't get any royalties from anything, but I will just tell you this is one of my favorite products. It may not work for you all the time, and it doesn't work for me all the time, but it does work a good amount of the time. This is just like a calf claim. It's basically like dehydrated placenta in a nice little bottle. It needs to go on when the calf is wet. And my little trick is that I actually will take a little bit of milk from the mom and trickle it from the nose all the way back down the head, down the back, and just kind of sprinkle that on there. I obviously don't do this with every calf, but if I have somebody that's not pairing up very well, or if I had a prolonged dystocia, or I just need that mom to kick it in and be a little bit smarter about what she's doing, a lot of times that helps. So that's just a little trick from me. Medications are important to have in your calving box. I'm not going to talk about what kind of protocols that you should have, because that's something that you definitely need to set up with your own personal veterinarian and your relationship with what works with your operation. But I do want you to make sure that you look at expiration dates, especially if some of these you haven't used since last year. Make sure they're not expired. Also, make sure that you have them stored properly. Oxytocin actually needs to be stored in the refrigerator. Make sure they haven't been exposed to extreme temperatures, so hot or cold. Few extras that are in my box would just be a thermometer to check that baby. Needles, I like to have 18 gauge, 5/8 or 3/4 for the babies, and then I do like 16 gauge, 3/4 to a full inch for the cows. Disposable syringes, usually most of the time you can get by with 6 and 12 cc syringes, maybe 3 if you're doing something smaller. Outside of my box, I do have a stainless steel bucket. This is just really handy to put in that disinfectant. I also use that to maybe milk the cow out. It's just nice, and it's nice to clean and easy to have. Tags and a tagger are nice to have as an extra, just to make sure you can identify that baby. I would say I would not recommend tagging or really doing anything until we make sure that they've mothered up and you've got that colostrum in that baby, because we don't want to interfere with that process at all. And also be aware of frozen ears. That can definitely cause a little bit of a problem when you're putting a tag in it. So I would delay that if you feel like you've got some frozen ears there. And then the last thing is a calving record book, and Dr. Jobman will talk about what to have in that record book, but it's nice to have something to write it down. So outside of my box is a calf jack. I do use a calf jack, and that's not a bad thing. You just need to know how to use it. So there's a lot of different ones out there. Make sure that you know how yours works. Make sure it's clean. Make sure there aren't any snags on it from the year before, that the chain's not broken, that you're not going to have a surprise when you get out there to use it. The other thing is know when it's okay to use it. So like I said, you have 2 legs and a head, and they're coming properly, and you're not going to have an issue. The biggest thing is to know when to stop using it. If you're not getting any progress, if you're, if you just feel like you need a little help, there's never any shame in calling for someone else, because you can do so much damage with those, way more than what is necessary. So just know when to stop. So a fun thing, this obviously is, I guess it's not necessary, but it makes my life easier. Udder Techs are my favorite thing in the world. They are just a waterproof bibs, and they come in all different colors and all different sizes, and they even have little kids sizes. So, it's nice to have if you have little ones that are showing and washing calves. Regardless, they keep me dry and they keep me warm when it's freezing out, because if you're wet and you leave the barn, it's not pleasant. And then also a headlamp, because it's just nice to have hands free when you're working in there. There were a few questions about warming, so I'll just briefly touch this about your babies. There's a lot of commercial warming huts out there. This is one that I use personally. A Polydome is nice. It's got a little floor inside of it. You plug it in, it blows warm air through the calf. But before that, there's other options from that. Like, for example, this is a calf that was on the floor bed of my truck. So the same concept there. We picked it up, it was chilled, we throw it in there, we put the floor heat on it and dry it off, and it does a good job there too. The other one I don't have a picture of, unfortunately, but I've done it multiple times in practice, and we actually, Dr. Clark did it quite a bit last spring too at GPEVC, but using a tub of warm water. So mineral tubs, if the calf is small enough, filling that with some warm water and submersing that calf. Obviously the head's going to stay up above water, and you're going to monitor that baby, but that slow circulation of the heat will definitely help to warm that baby up. You might need to add more warm water over time, but it does do a good job. Two things you want to make sure when you're doing warming options with these babies is that you watch for overheating. It definitely can happen. You can't throw that calf in this hut and walk away for the day. You need to make sure you have that thermometer out there and check often. Usually by the time that calf gets to about 99 degrees, it's going to be able to self-temperature regulate outside of this heat source, so you can probably take them out at that point. And then the biggest thing is making sure that you keep these clean, because this thing can become the biggest source of infection and bacteria. You know, if there's manure in there, or if you had a respiratory virus going on, it's warm and it likes to continue to live. So make sure that you clean that out really, really well.
Lindsay, we've got a couple questions. Oh, perfect.
Yes, I can't see them. I'm sorry. So we'll have
No, it's okay. They're hiding. So we've got one from Dwight. He mentioned, if you pull a calf and it's cold outside, do you wait and see if it gets up to nurse, say maybe in an hour or two, or do you tube it?
I would wait. So normally if it's gonna, depending on the temperature, if it's super freezing and, you know, we've got a wind chill, so wind is obviously against our factor because those babies are wet. If you feel like you need to intervene there with a cold wind chill, then possibly you might want to take it in. But I'd like to see what that mom does, because if she starts to mother up right away and she's licking and being vigorous and that baby's trying to get up, we want to get them together first. So try not to interfere with that bond. But if you think that, you know, there was any concern, maybe that baby's not standing, and you want to get there, then I would be intervening.
Perfect. We've got a couple more questions here. So Scott mentioned that they use Lysol instead of Orphan No More. Have you used it to cover the old cow scent?
No. Nope. And I don't think I've heard that one before. So I don't know. I might question about having my cow licking Lysol. I don't know if that would cause a little bit of an issue, but maybe somebody else wants to weigh in on that too.
We'll see if anybody wants to throw any other comments in. And we've got one more question here. Could you give a couple common scenarios when you would use oxytocin?
Yes. So myself, oxytocin can be helpful. Two scenarios, I guess. One, and this is something that I would talk to your veterinarian about, but just from pulling lots and lots of calves, if I reach in and my calf isn't up in the birth canal, oxytocin, backing up, oxytocin basically helps stimulate muscle contractions. So think of it like that. And the uterus is one giant muscle. So every time you give that, you're going to start to stimulate that to contract down. So you want to make sure, obviously, that the birth canal is open. You do not want to be giving that if you reach in and you can't feel calf, like if you feel like it's a dead end. I have used it if the calf is coming, but she's down in the birth canal a little bit. It does help push them up, but only use that if it's open. And if you have questions, I wouldn't use it. The second thing with oxytocin is it does help, because it's a muscle contractor. You think of the uterus like that too. Oxytocin does not produce milk, so it's not like it's going to magically make milk appear, but it helps contract the muscles around the udder, and it helps milk let down. So she's going to have as much milk as she has there, and oxytocin is not going to give you any more, but it's going to help that stimulate it to maybe let down a little bit better. And that's okay to use. You know, technically, maybe I usually don't go past 24 hours. And this is, again, a preference. I don't have solid data to tell you what's right or not, but myself, I mean, maybe if you get a couple days out, we're kind of past that window as far as if oxytocin is going to help or not. But it also helps the uterus contract down, because it's again a muscle and it's contracting, and it's going to slow itself down. So those would be the two times I'd use it. But again, I would talk to your veterinarian as to what they feel is the best option for you.
Great. Thank you. Great questions, guys. Do we have any other questions? And we can always touch on some more questions if you guys have some at the end. So feel free to include those in the chat if you think of any. And Checking here. I don't see any more. Lindsay, did you have anything else before we switch over to Erin?
Nope, that's it. If anybody has any questions, you can type them in there too later. So
Perfect.
Hey, Casey, before you switch over,
Yes, Paul.
sorry, I was trying to type this in and, but I'll just say it. So can you mention when you're talking about warming a calf, what's your low temperature where it's time to warm that calf? And you mentioned 99 degrees would be your safe temperature to quit warming the calf. But what are the minimum temperatures you're looking at? When do you decide it's time to throw the calf in the warming box?
that's a good question because it's not necessarily black and white, and you probably realize that. But what I look at in a calf is shivering is actually a really good thing. So the shivering response tells me that the body is working. So if you have a calf that's really dumpy and cold, maybe the extremities, the ears feel cold and the feet feel cold, and it's not shivering, we're in trouble. And a lot of times you'll tempt them and they're going to be, you know, if you're seeing like 92, 94, 92, we've got some issues, obviously, if it's down below that. But I would really use the demeanor of that baby to gauge when you should come in. The other thing I didn't say about warming the calf that's really important is colostrum actually helps. So you think about warming them from the inside out. So if you can get something in that baby, as long as you can set them sternal, I would not recommend trying to dump some milk into them if they're laying on their side and not sitting up. But if they're holding their head up and they have a little bit of vigor that way, you can get some warm colostrum in them. That'll start it, and then you start the extra warming, you know, whatever source you're using. But definitely just kind of use your gut and the demeanor and think about that. The shivering is a good thing to look at too.
Great question, Paul. Anyone else? I'm going to check here in the chat. Looks like we've got one from Stacy. Any issues with castrating right away?
Oh, castrating. Like banding a calf?
Oh.
Like, right?
Yeah, it separated that word. So
yeah. I would say I, again, would not mess with anything that's going to interfere with that mothering process. So I would not recommend going out there and probably castrating the minute that calf's been born. I would make sure that you give them some time. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of studies that show that the earlier you castrate, the better. So, you know, banding at birth is not a bad thing. A lot of people do that, and it's actually good for that calf. But I would make sure that that mom and that baby know who they belong to each other, and that it's got that first important meal before we stress anything else out.
Great. And then Malcolm had a question regarding what about stopping contractions?
So I don't know if I'll answer your question properly, but I don't really have anything that's going to stop other than, you know, the calf being born. It's just nature will stop that from happening. Now you'll have contractions on that uterus for, and I don't know the exact time frame, but for several hours after birth, the body's going to contract because that uterus is just telling itself to go from this big down to like this big. And so that takes over time, but you'll have contractions for, you know, a good day or so off of that, but not the intense ones of the delivery.
What I was asking about, like if you've got a calf that's coming backwards and you've got to push the calf back in,
Oh,
you don't want to be fighting against the contractions.
So
giving an epidural.
Yes, definitely doing an epidural would work. I would just make sure that you know, yeah, if you know how to give one and you know how to block, like do a tail block, that would definitely be beneficial. It doesn't stop them all the way, but it does kind of help a little bit. I wish it would stop it all the way in those situations, because there's a lot of times when my arms would appreciate that. But yeah, that's a good point to bring up.
Great questions, guys. This is wonderful. Yep. If you guys think of any other questions, feel free to add those in the chat, and we can address any questions again towards the end. Thank you, Lindsay. We'll see if Erin wants to share. If she's got slides, we can share those And we'll answer any other questions you guys have in the chat at the end.
Okay, can you guys see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, perfect. Good job, Dr. Lindsay. So my name is Erin Jobman. I'm another one of the veterinarians at the Great Plains Veterinary Educational Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. So I'm going to talk to you guys about how to derive some knowledge from your calving records. So what should you be keeping track of? When I think of calving records, I think of these little red books that seem to go out into circulation every year. Keeping records of the cow-calf identification, like the tag numbers, gender of the calves, dates. To me, that's pretty straightforward. But however, it can become more complicated with some of the information they put in there, like calving ease, vigor, nursing status, body condition score. So the million-dollar question, do you really need to keep track of all of that? I don't know. The part of answering that question is understanding the system that you're in, and without seeing every system, I can't answer that for you. If I've learned anything as a vet, we can drive down the road and every operation is going to operate differently. And you can go to the next county and there'll be a different culture. And you can go to the next state and the culture changes again. So I don't have a great cookie cutter answer for you there. So hopefully you don't sign off just yet. But I think you guys can answer these questions if you have production goals in mind for your herd or for your system, whatever it is that you guys are up to. So tonight I'm going to attempt to show you what you can do with calving dates to monitor the reproductive momentum of your herd. So I talk about production goals. To me, it's helpful just to outline what it is you're doing and remember why you're doing it. So for this case, pursuing a goal of 365-day calving interval is pretty common for this area in Nebraska. It helps assign the different production stages to the seasonality of available forages. Now, that doesn't mean everyone has to have a 365-day goal. My first job as a veterinarian was in South Central Texas, and the area I worked in has green growing grass throughout most of the year. And so the systems they're able to pull off look a little different than what we're used to here in Nebraska. But for tonight's purposes, we'll focus on 365 days. So hopefully this helps you check this out a little bit. So a 365-day interval, now assume that there's plus or minus 283 days gestation during the year. So this means the time the cow is pregnant, 283 days. I say plus or minus because not every cow is going to deliver on day 283. There's variance in this number, just like there's variance in people delivering before and well after their due dates. So subtract 283 from 365. And don't freak out and sign off again. I did the math for you and you get 82 days. So there's an 82-day window from the time of calving to the start of your breeding season. Now, some of those days are already spoken for as well, because there's a period known as postpartum anestrus. This is an unavoidable temporary state of infertility following calving, in which the cow recovers and prepares for the next breeding season. Postpartum anestrus lasts 50 to 80 days on average for a healthy, mature cow. This time period will increase if cows are thin, and heifers increase that number as well. So you can see how the 365 days fills up pretty quickly. I tried to make this little animation for you guys just to spell out a pretty typical operation for this area, with breeding season beginning June 1st calving dates would start around March 10th. That would be 283 days later. And then the postpartum anestrus period is going to be from April 28th to May 28th. So you can see about the time that she finishes anestrus and begins to cycle again is right when breeding season starts up again. So another timeline that I've assigned onto this 365-day scheme is the 60-day breeding season. So this number is going to fluctuate as well for different herd goals, but for tonight's purposes, we'll focus on 60 days and not worry about AI or other reproductive techniques. So we get the bulls turned out. Now, following mating, there's the likelihood of conceiving a viable pregnancy is 60 to 70%. So that means that 30% will fail due to fertilization failure or an early embryonic loss that happens within the first 14 days. And these numbers are normal. The normal heat cycle for a cow is 21 days long. So if mating occurs and fertilization fails, the cow is going to undergo the rest of the cycle and return to heat 21 days later. So with these numbers in mind, you can think 20, 40, 60, there's about 3 opportunities to become bred during a 60-day breeding season. So the timing of calving and breeding allow for creation of positive or negative momentum, and this is going to carry over from year to year. So positive momentum in your herd is ideal for this area. That means that most of the calves are going to calve early in your calving season, and in return, they breed early. So in this example, in the first 21 days of the breeding season, so the first heat cycle, 65% of the herd ideally becomes pregnant. And you can see in this chart, the labels from this paper from Dr. Larson and Dr. White, they're showing percentages. So I think of, if we have a herd of 100 head, in that first 21 days, 60 to 70% is going to be about 65 head, right? So then you go to the next 21 days and think of the 60 to 70% of the cows that are open at this point. So if you think of 100 head starting off, and then you breed 65 in the first heat cycle, you're going to end up with 35 open cows in this second heat cycle, and 2/3 of that, 60 to 70% of that, is going to be 23 that become bred. And you can see how that number kind of trickles off with the rest of the heat cycle. But that's what positive momentum is essentially 2/3 of the open cows when you start become bred, 2/3 of what's open for the next cycle are bred, and so on. So there is a thing such as negative momentum. Several things can play into that. Extending the breeding season longer than 60 days can allow for more cows to become pregnant. However, cows that conceive more than 52 days into the breeding season are unlikely to resume fertile heat cycles until the latter parts of next year's breeding season. And cows that conceive 82 days into the breeding season will not actually calve until the start of the following breeding season. And cows that are thin in body condition will contribute to negative momentum. If heifers calve late enough, they might not actually resume fertile cycles either. These heifers can turn up open and likely have normal breeding potential, but we're not given enough time to fulfill that postpartum anestrus period. Other problems that can contribute to this is not starting with fertile animals to begin with. So making sure you have fertile bulls and being free of any reproductive disease. And in this example, you can see they get past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 heat cycles there. So just a longer calving season, a longer breeding season, and you can see that curve isn't quite as tight in this example. So why does it matter? Personally, I think it goes back to understanding the goals of your system. For some people in regions, momentum might not be a priority, and that's fine. But for others, a herd with strong positive reproductive momentum can achieve and maintain 95% pregnancy success in a 60-day breeding season. The animals that conceive in the first 21 days of breeding season will have a significant impact on pounds weaned per cow exposed. Herds that are front-end loaded produce weaned calves that are older and heavier compared to herds that calve steadily throughout the calving season, even if both examples have the same breeding season and the same weaning dates. These cows that calve early in the calving season will complete the postpartum and estrus period before the start of breeding. And calving early in the season leads ultimately to an increased lifetime weight of calves weaned, as well as increased cow longevity in the herd because they don't turn up open as often when you go to preg check, ultimately impacting profitability and decreasing cow depreciation costs. So how do I do that? So we'll get back to the actual record keeping here a little bit. What you need to record in this example, this applies to using Excel, and what we're doing here is keeping track of the ID numbers of the cow and the calf and the calving dates. This is something that when I learned about this in school, I took this home and my brother and I did this. These are just screenshots that I've taken off of his records. And after I got him started with this, he's been maintaining this ever since. So I didn't alter any of this. I just took some screenshots in here so you guys can see an example of some real data. So Excel has lots of tricks in which you can generate the different heat cycles based on your calving dates. What we did here is kind of back calculate from knowing what day the bulls were turned out, or essentially knowing what day your breeding season starts. There's more than one way to do this. Obviously, Dr. Lindsay and Dr. Becky are on right now. I know they can chime in as well. But this is how we did this one for his records. So we're using days exposed to figure out when our heat cycles start. And so you can tell in his example that he's using 280, think back to the plus or minus 283 days, just pick a day. You don't have to split hairs too bad, but pick a day and count backwards. And so you can see what he's calling some early calvers in there. He has a little category by themselves because there's a handful that will turn up that are actually calving before that average 280, 283, whichever you want to go by. That can account for that. And then after that, the rest of these will start to fall into the first 21 days, the second 21 days, based off of when that breeding season started. And so he uses pivot tables. Depending on your comfort level, this is just something that he does. And then from there, you can formulate graphs pretty easily. In Dr. Larson's papers, they use histograms or bar graphs. But I wanted to show you what my brother's been doing here. Over the different years, you can see he's got different examples here. Instead of having a bar, this is just a line graph, but here's the earlies. And then as you progress through the first heat cycle, second, third, they have a fourth, and then the opens. And so you can see had something going on there, I'm not sure what, and then it's not a perfect data set, but you can see that general curve with positive momentum there. And if that's too much for you, the answer to your next question is yes, there's an app for that, thank goodness. The one I'm most familiar with is one that the Beef Cattle Institute, the BCI at Kansas State University came up with. It's pretty straightforward to my knowledge, and it can walk you through the different steps, and you can input your own data. It's pretty user-friendly. Even a quick Google search will come up with other options as well. I found an Excel sheet to download that's really user-friendly from South Dakota State University. So there's plenty of software out there if you're interested. This is just the one I'm most familiar with. You just input your data and you can kind of see here, it figures up your charts for you. Or if you're into just paper and pencil, this is another perfectly good option for you, especially if you're just getting started with this technique. This is something I came up with on my legal pad yesterday, just going through some of my brother's numbers of a different year. So what I did is just looked at the calendar and I wrote down the dates from Saturday to Sunday and just listed out weeks there. And so each tally mark over here is just a calf born in that week. So essentially, as your calving season is progressing, you're just going through and making tallies during the weeks of how many calves were born each week. And then after I got that charted out, I have a couple earlies here again that I didn't go back and do the math with that 283 gestation day starting, but just kind of eyeballing it here, I assigned that an early, and then I took these red lines and tried to chalk out first, second, and third heat cycles for you. So if you're not in a positive momentum scenario, don't be embarrassed or ashamed or anything like that. You know, it may not even work for your system that you're operating in, but if you think it does, I think it's a great opportunity to consult your local veterinarian. I think vets are a really underutilized resource in this department. They can help you generate this information and they can help you interpret it. And going back to the beginning, if you're having trouble coming up with goals for your herd and figuring out why you're doing what you're doing, the local vet can be helpful with that too. We see all kinds of things wherever we go, and your veterinarian can help you implement strategies to shift the momentum if your herd isn't up to whatever standard you want to be at. And keep this in mind that it's going to take time to change momentum too, as it carries over year to year. And it may require culling more cows initially than you may be used to, things like that. So if you go through this and your herd does fit with positive momentum, that's great. Continuing this throughout the years, like my brother had done with the line graph, especially going back in time, if you have the records, can add a lot of context to your herd and ultimately serve as a report card, especially as you run into years that are maybe less than ideal with your pregnancy rates. And you can even track individual cows' performances year after year in your herd, whatever you want to do. So I hope you find this information helpful. I hope it's not too much math for you and I didn't scare you off, but I remember learning about this momentum for the first time and just feeling excited because this is something I could do today and add meaning to the herd and even have a potential of impacting profitability. So I encourage you to reach out to your local vet to help you out along the way, especially with office time that saves our backs and our shoulders. So I don't think you'll find a vet that'll turn you down for an office appointment. But best wishes in the new year and thank you for your time.
Great, thank you, Erin. Do we have any questions for Erin? Feel free to add those in the chat or you're welcome to unmute and ask a question directly. So I think let's see if we've got one. Perfect. So Paul's got one here. To help build the positive momentum, do you think it would be beneficial to give Lutalice around bull turnout or 5 days post turnout to cows that calve late in the calving season to get them to cycle early in that breeding season? Or is it better to remove those cows and then replace those cows with those cows that cycle early on their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually several ways you can go about generating positive momentum in your herd. And again, I can't stress enough involving your local vet, somebody that's been to your operation and knows the system you're in. But ultimately, proper heifer development and calving heifers ahead of the cows is going to contribute to positive momentum. You know, just allowing them to have enough time to complete postpartum in estrus will keep them on track. culling any cows that are open or late bred when you go to preg check is another way to contribute to momentum. Certainly sinking, seeders, reproductive technologies like that can be applied too, for sure. Yeah, those are all good options.
Great question, Paul. Let's see, I'm checking here. So what software is best for tracking calving? If maybe you don't have a registered herd, do you think software is the best way to go? Or do you think some of your pen and paper examples might be best to track that?
I think it just depends on the person and your system and what your goals are.
And certainly your comfort level with technology. There's a lot of opportunities out there if you are tech savvy. Again, I'm not familiar with all of them. The BCI app is the one I'm most familiar with, and that works really well for people. But certainly pen and paper is nothing to be ashamed of either. That works just great for a lot of people. I don't know if Dr. Lindsay or Dr. Becky have any ideas of things that work in their herds.
You're exactly right, Dr. Jobman, because it's basically based on what you need. If you have registered cattle and you're having to get a lot more information, then maybe one of those software like CowSense or Cattle Max or something would be beneficial, where you could just generate a report. But it absolutely just depends on how tech savvy you are and how much you want to collect.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it does, go back to what are your goals and what are you trying to measure, and what data can you collect to answer those questions and meet those goals. Randy has a question here, Erin. I've have several years of data and find some cows calve all over the year where others are more consistent. Should you sell those cows who are variable in their calving dates?
Again, it depends on what your goals are. If you're shooting for keeping the herd, constricted to those first 3 heat cycles, I don't really sweat variation from if this cow calved in the 2nd cycle one year to the 3rd cycle the next year, and if she somehow comes back to the 2nd cycle the next year. I don't really sweat those little details as much as I do just the general look of the curve overall.
And Scott had a comment in here. It'd be great to know how to fix your unfavorable breed back process. We have good breed back, but what threshold should we watch for? We have a good relationship with our local vet. However, it'd be ideal to have more an in-depth understanding of how we can use some of those analytics to drive better business goals. So I'm not sure, Scott, are you asking about understanding maybe what goals or what specific analytics you should be looking at when it comes to breed back and maybe managing that postpartum interval? Is that kind of what I'm getting from your?
Yeah, kind of both of those. So as we think about kind of our overall breed back, right now we're doing pretty good, but kind of what kind of thresholds do we know that we're going to cross over to start watching, right? So knowing some of those thresholds to help us understand the analytics a little bit better, right? So the end goal is not only just capturing the analytics, but being able to utilize those and know what those pain points are and how to mitigate those.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and really important to take into consideration. Honestly, I don't really have a one-size-fits-all type of endpoint for you, especially in cow-calf. That's really hard to recommend. But yeah, certainly working with your vets, people that know the area, marketers that know the area, they can help you with that. We're happy to help out too at GPEVC, but as far as a big cookie cutter answer, I don't really have one.
There is some good data on calving distributions, and knowing that if you're keeping heifers that calve in that first cycle, those heifers are going to consistently be the ones that get bred first. They're the ones that are going to be able to calve first for you. So like that sort of data is important to remember, that if you're going to develop heifers, you want to keep those girls that come from the first calvers. Also, for steers on the market side, you're going to get obviously a higher weight if you're getting steers that are coming from that first calving cycle. But they also had some research done, UNL did that those calves will have like a higher marbling score, and they actually will come better off on the rail if they're coming off that first cycle. So those, like that sort of goals, there's, you know, measurable reasons for it. And then what Malcolm said too, collecting all of this means nothing if you write it on a piece of paper and then you just throw it, you know, aside. So looking at that, and maybe you haven't had that relationship, and that's what Dr. Erin talked about with your vet, but you know, it's great to be like, this is what's on my paper. I don't like what's going on down here. What can we do to fix that?
Great questions. Does anyone else have any other questions? I might throw one out here, a little off subject in terms of our record keeping, but does anyone maybe have some examples of some user-friendly, maybe cost-effective scales for measuring birth weight? Or are there some tools or things that you have in your toolbox that might help record that?
The calving tape is always questionable if that works or not, but that is a tool, I guess, that's available. I don't know where it comes from at Mark, but they have the one that we attach to the back of the Ranger that you can weigh on, and I don't have a source where that comes from. I don't use it personally, but those are nice. You know, there's a lot of stuff out commercially. Maybe somebody else has one that they use that they like.
Yep.
Becky.
Becky
Casey?
put in the chat, hanging feed scales work great as well.
Casey, we used the tape, and when we started using it, we checked it against the scale. So we did both. Now this is a small sample set because probably the first 10 or so came back pretty good. So we thought, well, that works. We'll just go with that. So it's not nothing you would publish or a great study or anything, but it seems to be pretty accurate, at least for 10 calves.
That's at least a good start. And I know quite a few people that can utilize it. And I think being consistent with how you're measuring